Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. I am broadcasting to you from Canberra, which is located on the Ngunnawal land. I'd like to pay respect and acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which, wherever you are watching this webinar. And I'm really excited to be bringing this topic to you. My name is Peter Adamek. I'm the CEO of Canberra Innovation Network. And the webinar today is titled The Great Office Exodus, the Longevity of Remote Work in a Post-COVID World. And what a great topic it is to kind of look at from different perspectives, because we all had to, at one point in 2020, to start working from home, and that happened not just to us. That happened around the world almost instantly, and it affected us greatly. And as we began to learn how to deal with the situation, whole range of issues have emerged, and we will explore those today with the wonderful speakers I'm about to introduce to you shortly. But briefly about the Canberra Innovation Network and why is it me that I'm hosting this conversation. We work with entrepreneurs. We support people who want to build companies based on unique innovations that can change our world for the better. And they often start these companies in their bedrooms, in their garages or university labs. And they don't have access to all the equipments that the corporate office may be offering. And their main actually milestone in making it happen is when they can afford to rent an office. So they come from that place, and we run here a co-working space. And early on in the pandemic, I published an article about the future of co-working spaces, because I believe that's one of the models that will become more and more popular as we enable the transition of people to be working from homes, from the corporate office, or from another office in any city where they may find themselves, or where they may be holidaying and may need to pop into work in a place that's set up for that. So that's probably the perspective I'm bringing to this panel. Also, University of New South Wales, Canberra is obviously a foundation member of the Canberra Innovation Network. And so I'm super excited to be able to host this conversation today. Before I introduce the speakers, I would like to note that you as viewers can ask questions during this webinar. And on YouTube, there is a chat function. So you please make your comments, make your questions, be respectful, of course. Those questions will be moderated through to us, and I'll be able to ask the speakers on your behalf. And with that, I'd like to now welcome on the stage our panel of expert speakers, and I will introduce them to you in alphabetical order. So first, let me start with Catherine Fox. Catherine Fox is a leading commentator on women and the workforce. She's an award-winning journalist and author and presenter. She had a long career with the Financial Review, where she wrote the weekly Corporate Woman column. In 2017, Catherine was awarded the Walkley Award for Women's Leadership in Media. She is an advisor on gender equity to the Australian Defence Force. Sits on the Australians Investing in Women board, and is a co-founder of the Sydney Women's Giving Circle. Catherine is also a UNSW alumna, having graduated with a Master of Arts degree. Welcome, Catherine. Next speaker in alphabetical order is Kathy Hilliard, who is a partner with KPMG, responsible for leading the leadership, people, and change practice in Canberra. She is a highly experienced consultant with performance management, organization development, cultural reform, and leadership development experience working with clients across federal and state governments, and also with the not-for-profit and the private sector. Kathy is also an outstanding speaker, facilitator, and process designer. Kathy is a UNSW alumna, having graduated from a graduate diploma in management in 2004 and a Master of Business Administration executive level in 2006. So welcome with us, Kathy. 1,000 Australian public service employees. So this is the wonderful panel that we have the opportunity to interview and interrogate on the topic, looking at it. And a very important lens is the gender culture. What changes are you observing in how the corporate office is being used? And how do these changes impact organization? No, still cannot hear you.
How about now?
Perfect.
Okay, I'm so sorry. My Jabra has stopped working just in the interim period while you were talking. Okay, so just thinking about, I was just acknowledging the traditional owners also of the lands on which everybody is joining us today, and really pleased to be here to talk about this topic. I think I was thinking, how is this affecting culture and workplaces? And I was reflecting on, you know, the fact, as you just said, Peter, that the COVID has been a bit of a catalyst, I guess, for a change in attitudes to work and to what it means to go to work. But it's not the only thing that's changing our mindsets and attitudes and expectations around work. And I think increasingly, you know, the complexity that we all deal with in our working lives and in the world more generally, and of course the ongoing disruption of technology, you know, technology and new forms of technology is also, you know, swirling around us in terms of shifting and changing what we're thinking. And I'm also mindful that today we're probably going to talk more about the office worker, and I'm very cognizant that, you know, our frontline workers in health and policing and teaching and retail and tourism have probably got, you know, slightly different set of challenges that they're facing and expectations that are coming in terms of work. But let's focus in on our office workers for now. And I was reflecting on what happened in the COVID experience, particularly in the lockdown when we all were sort of forced to be at home, and we saw some really interesting things emerge. I think around a real increase in the concern and care for our people at unprecedented levels. We were worried about people's safety and their mental well-being as they were isolated, and we were thinking, you know, about new and different ways of connecting people formally and informally. So there was a lot of, you know, discussion in workplaces, I think, about how do we keep people connected when they're remote. And we all switched pretty much virtually overnight to whether it was Teams or Zoom or different platforms, and we got more and more. We saw, I think, a lot more vulnerability in leaders sharing personal stories. We saw what windows into people's lives. We actually saw an increase in productivity in many cases, and lots of organisations have said productivity went up instead of down, which was a great concern right at the start. And then I think we got used to the real true notion of flexibility. You know, we saw all those lovely stories of people working in their pajamas and all those kinds of things. So, but then there were some challenges for people around, particularly people working in, I think, shared houses, shared apartments. You know, in Canberra here, there's a lot of very small apartments with 3 or 4 people living in them, trying to share the kitchen table as a workplace. It wasn't terribly fulfilling. People with children, and of course, sometimes more serious issues around people having kind of unhealthy home circumstances that meant it was hard for them to be at home and focus on work. So how's that playing out? How's that playing out for us now? I think it's really meant that organisations are having to really come to terms with the changing expectations and values around work. We're having to be much more aware of our own values and that they might be different to others in terms of what it means to go to work. There seems to be a bit of a rise in the notion of choice as an employee value proposition. You know, those employers that are offering greater flexibility, more contemporary work spaces that actually you want to go to. The notion of the difference, making conscious choices about when I need to work on my own and have quiet time versus the collaborative, you know, work. And I think increasingly given our complex world, collaborative work is becoming more and more important. So even in the workplace, we need a different environment, not just an expectation that people come and sit at a desk and plug in and work alone all day. So I think there's a few things happening, and culturally, these conversations that we need to have around how do we want to work and where do we want to work and how do we make that all work together to create high performance is sort of a discussion I think that we're all having.
Excellent. So many questions coming to my mind. There's a rich opportunity to explore the vulnerability of leaders, and does the corporate office make the leaders less, to behave in a different way than if they're actually talking to people from their living room, and what is the effect on the culture and on the performance? I think that could be a whole webinar. Thank you for the opening statement. I'm now going to Catherine. So Catherine, you focus on women in the workforce and in the workplace. So how are the current models of work, including working from home, working from office, and the hybrid and the transition? How are these regimes impacting women?
Thanks, Peter, and thanks for having me here today. I think I should start as Kathy did, just to acknowledge that we know that women are overrepresented in casual and service areas in terms of employment. So when I start to talk about working from home, I am more than aware that that does not apply to many women. So just to be very clear about that. It also means that women have disproportionately suffered during the pandemic period. And we've seen some statistics on that, which are, really chilling. So I might come back to that. But I just think at the moment, when this all started to unfold, really a year ago, I was asked to write a feature on it for the Australian's business magazine, The Deal. And so I was speaking to a few people, and I think there was a kind of a consensus from across that catchment that there could be quite an upside for women. It wasn't absolutely, it was going to have some pluses and minuses. And but there might be a window into seeing a recalibration of the domestic division of labour. We might actually see perhaps men who had been out of the home a lot and working long hours, actually home-based, and seeing actually, oh, that's what goes on here, right? That's quite labour intensive, and that there could be, a little bit more sharing of that, a little bit more perhaps understanding of each other's roles, paid roles and unpaid roles. So I look back on that now and think, what was I thinking? Because I think the thing that I didn't really make allowance for was that during periods of recession and pandemic, particularly stressful period, we tend to default quite quickly back to gender stereotypes and norms. So in fact, over the last year, we've seen women's unpaid labour increase by 1 hour a day, which is a staggering amount. Men's has gone up too, but not at anywhere near that proportion. So what we know that with women having to supervise children's learning, or perhaps looking after elderly relatives and checking in on them, just all the things that we've been reading about over the last year have had a significant impact. I have to say, as an advocate for women, and particularly the women in the workforce area, I was fascinated to see everyone working flexibly after having been such an advocate for it. And I worked flexibly for a long time. I didn't always work from home, but I did vary my hours and so on. So I was fascinated to see how that worked out. And I think it's been very interesting, hasn't it, to see that in fact productivity didn't suffer, as you say, it actually went up in some areas. Certainly the demarcation between private and paid work life has become even more fuzzy, and we have heard reports of people working extremely long hours, maybe doing their domestic chores, going back to the computer. Now, let's be honest, that happened beforehand, but I think even more so now. But I really did hope that that flexible working paradigm would start to be more acceptable, and that we'd see that some of the mythology about it would actually wear away. So I think that there's still that potential, but I would just finally say, in terms of sort of, day-to-day matters, I think women in particular being disconnected from office dynamics, if that's the kind of environment that they work in, can have a really poor effect for them. And it goes back to a whole lot of things that happen in workplaces. I mean, women are often told, look, it's about doing a good job and results. But actually, we all know that it's about a whole lot of other things that are highly subjective, including that very overworked term merit. I have a lovely definition of it that was given to me years ago, that it actually stands for mates elevated regardless of intellect or talent. So next time you hear the word merit, you might want to think about that. And that in fact, that can be a bit pernicious, and there can be real penalties. And if families, for example, have recalibrated the way that they work, paid and unpaid again, it will often be, the onus will be back on women's shoulders. And the reason that I can say this is those statistics, also the impact on women's leadership, which has been dire. So over the last year, for example, even pre the pandemic, the number of women running ASX 200 companies had gone down dramatically. There were 25 CEOs appointed to the ASX last year, ASX 200, one woman out of the 25. So we've got some real problems at that sort of micro level. My concern is what it does to the macro level. Women's workforce participation rate has also plummeted. So that's a very quick sort of nutshell about some of those daily issues, but also the impact that can have for women much more seriously over the future.
Thank you. Thank you. It just means that we need to work harder on these things, because the changing situation is not always playing in our cards to have more women, across the workforce the way we would like to.
Well, and Peter, obviously the things that are going on in Canberra at the moment around these conversations, which are not unrelated, so workplace safety and so on, are also incredibly important.
Absolutely. And yeah, I just noted one of the things you mentioned there, and the impact around the sort of not being able to see what the atmosphere is in the team from just sensing, yeah, and how it may be different for different genders. I think that's an interesting point, and I would like to come back to it if we can. But before we do that, Sue, what does the research tell us? Is there any emerging scientific evidence about the impact of these changing modes of work on workforce, and especially on women? What are we finding through research?
Hi, everyone, and thanks, Peter, and thanks to the other panelists. And Catherine, that's quite depressing. So that means there's still more men called Andrew in ASX companies than there are women.
You're absolutely right, and it is depressing.
Yeah, okay. So I've been thinking about this, and yes, keeping an eye on the research that's been coming out in the last year about how people have been working from home. And before the pandemic hit, there were lots of concerns around productivity and performance, and people were often thought to be working from home and they'd be sitting watching Netflix. That was a big concern. There was also concern around work-life balance and gender equality. A year on, it's been shown that productivity pretty much has increased across the board for people who can work from home, and office workers working from home. And that has been the resounding story of working from home during the pandemic. So the research that myself and Linda Colley have conducted found that productivity went through the roof. There's about 2/3 of managers believed that their teams were more productive or just as productive working from home during the pandemic as before. And that statistic holds across industries. And I was just reading a report released by Microsoft, and they found that 70% of people believe that they are more productive as well. And so that's one of the big messages. The story around gender equality is more mixed, and as Catherine was explaining, there are lots of downsides. Women taking on triple shifts of homeschooling, domestic responsibilities, paid work, doing more in the home. And so that was a big feature as well. Our research was slightly different. We didn't find too many differences between men and women. These are public servants who may have been better resourced than a lot of other people to work from home. So the public service is kind of a really interesting case study, because people were saying it worked really well for them and for their families, and they loved not having commuting time. They spent that extra time with their families, or either by doing work. They weren't working particularly long hours either, which we were surprised at. So lots of people have said that work intensification has occurred. Employees are working longer hours when they're working from home. We didn't find that with our research, but we acknowledge that it has occurred in some industries. So there's lots of interesting things happening around working from home, and as employees are transitioning back into workplaces, how hybrid working will pan out. And building on what Catherine has said, I think one of the things to be careful of or to be mindful of is that while we think that hybrid working, which is employees working from home a couple of days a week and in the office probably 3 days a week, while we think that that could have really positive impacts for employees generally and for gender equality, I think gender inequality could feature in unexpected ways. So we're starting to hear, for example, that men want to go back into the office. Women want to stay working at home because it's easier to balance work and family, whereas men want that connection more. So men are starting to go back into the office. And if that's the case, where we have more women working at home, blokes in the office, it means women are less visible and they're not going to get selected for the more choice assignments, the good bits of work. And so I think that there are downsides to hybrid working as we go forward that we need to be mindful of, and things that we probably haven't even thought of yet.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for that introduction to all of you. These are very, very rich thoughts that we can explore more, but I already have a question from the audience. So I'm thinking I'll start with you, Sue, because you in your last sentence talked about the future and what we must be careful of. And this is a question from Wendy. So how do you break the cycle of a supervisor who discourages work from home? And we can all imagine what Wendy means here, because they believe that I need to see you to be able to confirm that you are actually working and that you are productive. And can you expand a little bit on that concept of the impacts of that presenteeism versus productivity in the workplace?
Yes, we researched a couple of years ago how middle managers progress gender equality. And one of the big things that came through was managers saying that they had difficulty managing employees working from home. They couldn't see what they were doing. It was that whole presenteeism thing. And so we'd say to them, well, how do you manage that person sitting in front of you? How do you know that they're not goofing off on Facebook or Insta for the youngsters? So it's the same principle. So if your manager, can see you in the workplace, they can still check on you at home. They can still see what you're doing at home. So it's about performance management. And so it really shouldn't be that hard. But we know that presenteeism is a really strong undercurrent. But we're also seeing that managers are starting to become more outcomes focused. And our research has shown that managers have had an epiphany. They've said, oh, look, it does work. It's been proven to work. And so now lots of them are saying to us, we're going to look at outcomes. We're becoming more outcomes focused rather than focused on bums on seats in the office.
And I just wondered if I could jump in there. So working for such a long time for a newspaper, there's such transparency around outcomes, results. Your name is on an article. It couldn't be more of a clear link. And yet I had an editor who famously just banned anyone from ever working from home. Now, that was a control issue. There's no question. That is a classic, I have to see you. And you're quite right, Sue. Of course you can be, looking at Facebook or indeed padding out your day with a whole lot of things, going off for 2 hours, ostensibly doing something that's work-related and may not be. So I think that's what's been so interesting about this period. And I think that one of the things about having a hybrid model is about having it introduced in a way that there's some consistency around it. And again, looking at that from a feminist perspective, if you like, for women have always worked shift work, for example. Women are still mainly make up the nursing cohort, but it's about consistency. So actually understanding that certain days are maybe mandatory for the office, but actually having some planning, because that has such an impact on childcare, picking kids up, other, unpaid commitments and so on. So, but yes, I absolutely agree that connection between control and seeing people. You would think, wouldn't you, after this last year, that would be well and truly challenged. Yeah.
Such an interesting topic. I'm sure, Kathy, you have something to contribute to that conversation as well.
Yes, and we published something early in the COVID lockdown period around trying to encourage workplace leaders to think more about performance rather than productivity. And what I mean by that is, setting the conditions for people to do their best work, regardless of where they're located, is actually a sort of a two-way responsibility. And so, those ideas about setting clear expectations, about focusing on outcomes, finding new ways to exchange feedback around work output and quality, thinking about ways that people are motivated differently, and establishing, conversations around that, being more conscious about how you're engaging with people formally and informally. There's a whole raft of tools available to leaders in workplaces to set people up for success, regardless of where they're sitting. But we did, I'm thinking there's a bit of a wave of kind of awareness now that a supervisor who's saying these things still, after all we've been through, perhaps some discussions around what would it look like to do a great job and be available for you to feel comfortable. I would be initiating that conversation now, because I'm hoping there's other supervisors in that workplace that aren't expecting people to be present just for the sake of being present. But it is really difficult, we found, for managers, as Catherine mentioned, to overcome that idea that if I can see you, you must be working. It's very difficult if you've got deeply held views about that.
Absolutely. I agree.
Can I jump in with a comment? The other thing that strikes me is that flexible working arrangements and working from home has traditionally been viewed as a reward that you give your high performers. That went out the window with the pandemic. And so now the question is, how can you enable employees to work from home, to work hybridly, if that's a word, without it being seen as a reward? Because if we're going to go back to rewarding people and letting them work from home because they're a high performer, it's going to lead back into an us and them mentality and a two-tiered workforce. And so I think one of the big shifts has occurred is that flexible working arrangements are no longer seen as a reward, but just a new way or an extended way of doing things.
And so a number of years ago, when Telstra brought in that all roles flex policy, it was very interesting. And of course, one of the things that they tweaked around that policy was that you didn't have to give a reason for working flexibly. And I agree with you. I think it's got to be, it's got to stop being a reward. It's another way of working. Let's absolutely understand how we do that, and how we do it so that the whole team, and I do understand the New South Wales Public Service Commission did a massive flexible work project. And the woman who was running it, who I interviewed this time last year, was saying that one of the things they did is bring in a team-based model so that everyone understands on the team, okay, this is what's going to work for us. And this is how we're going to manage it. And that's that appears to me from some of the work I've done. I don't know if you've got anything in that area, but that seems to be the way that it operates well. Otherwise, people feel like, oh, it's unfair. I'm doing more than so-and-so. It's not working out for me. But it was very, very interesting to hear that. And as she said, something that we thought would take 3 years has happened in about 3 months. Because she said, I'm not saying I wanted the pandemic, but, clearly something had been massively condensed. So, yeah, very interesting.
Very interesting also from the innovation perspective, because I feel like when we were part of the lockdown situation, which was out of the ordinary, I think the permission to innovate and try things has become like ubiquitous. Everyone could do that. And it was, I think, the impact on productivity overall, we have already talked about it. It was extremely positive. Everything changed, and that change brought some positive things as well. We started to look more after people, etc., etc. But what is happening as we begin to return to office. And there's a question from Lynn, and I guess the fear is that what if we come back and these situations like Wendy described are becoming the new norm, like we need to tighten the screws and we need to be in control of our outcomes that we produce, and that fear that those managers might have that, oh, people will not be working, will become the new norm, or will come back to it. So can you explore the topic of return and how is it affecting performance, but also people?
I might have a quick, it sort of links to the previous discussion a bit too, but I think what could be happening is in some workplaces is we have now a new layer of undiscussables around working judgments about what others ought to do. And, you know, we want the type of organisation we want to be, and we should be consciously creating some rules of engagement around that might be a good starting point.
It's an interesting point. Catherine or Sue, do you want to comment on the return to the office?
Yeah, I'll make a comment. So, yes, we know that trust increased during the pandemic and during lockdown, and that the psychological contract, which is the relationship that we all have with our managers and with our organisation, was strengthened throughout COVID. And part of that was also because, you know, we were all working to a shared purpose. We were in a crisis. Let's all get on with it, and, you know, Team Australia kind of stuff. Now that that's gone, there are concerns about how do we maintain that cohesion on people to us, because we know that everyone is really busy at work, and to keep thinking about gender equality as well. Haven't we done that yet? And obviously,
clearly, I reckon there's just been a fascinating power shift over this period.
Like we need to be more productive, therefore here will be our model? Or is it more the other forces, like, oh, we invested in this, we have these buildings, or there's a pressure, and you know, what are some of the factors that are influencing these decisions that you see going forward, and what's the future likely to be like? Big question, I know, and I'm looking at Kathy.
Yeah, well, look, I think we are all rethinking our real estate, our property footprints, and all of those kind of things, particularly in CBDs. And you know, you can imagine a future where there's much more blended workplaces, where your sort of model, Petra, where, you know, you might have multiple organisations sharing an office space. I know we at KPMG are already subletting some of our spaces, but also it's not just about the volume of the space, it's what we're doing with the spaces. And in Catherine's comment around the sort of this shift in power, I totally agree, particularly where there are, you know, is competitive labour markets. You know, who's offering the coolest spaces to work in, and making them places that I want to go to work, and cultures that I want to go and work in, where people are valued, where there's social cohesion, you know, all of those kind of things, so that work becomes a social experience, not just a place we go to, you know, provide our labour. Because we can provide our labour from anywhere. I can provide my labour from the back seat of the car now, you know, it's not really about where you are. So I think that and there has been something interesting around the environment here too, hasn't there? You know, in the reduction in you know, logjam traffic and peak hours, and I think there's so much to think about in this whole thing around balancing acts. I know for federal government there was some suggestion that everybody should return to work, and that was a bit of a factor around the economic impacts on the CBD and on businesses operating around, you know, our office spaces. But I think a lot of organisations have just kind of said, well, we actually have to still continue a hybrid model, because people want the choice, and this power that people will choose to move to somewhere where they get that. I think it is something that's definitely a factor in all of this. But I think we need to get creative about our workspaces, you know, make them more social and contribute to the collaboration and the innovation that you were talking about, Peter.
Absolutely. And we have here 50 companies in one office workspace, which is shared. And
Yes.
many of the companies here, they have workers in Norway and co-founders elsewhere. And I think what has happened with this major seismic shift, I would say it's an earthquake, it's not a seismic shift.
Yes,
That happened in 2020. Basically, you know, the global organization was made available to everyone, and there is a war for talent out there. And I believe personally that the talent is more important than the property. So while we have to create fantastic workplaces that attract the best talent to work in those places, we also now have the opportunity to work with everyone around the world. And I think that's redefining the business landscape, definitely. So you are unmuted. I'm assuming you want to put in
I've always got a comment. Yeah. Catherine, I think your observation that there's been a power shift is really interesting. And I've been thinking about this, and I'm thinking, if this change is going to stick, will it be driven by employees who traditionally, you know, haven't had as much power as their organisations, of course? And if it's driven by organisations, there's a couple of competing forces. Organisations will want employees to come back into the workplace so they can see them. It's that issue of control that we were talking about before. And we can see that this is happening with, as Kathy mentioned, that the Australian Public Service, and Catherine mentioned it was one of the first public sector organisations to get employees back into their usual workplaces. And just yesterday, the Victorian government came out and said that they want employees back in the office 3 days a week. And this is so there's those issues, and then there's the issues around organisations wanting to save costs by reducing their office space. So that's another big one. And then trying to get people back into workplaces so that they go and buy coffee from, you know, the people in the CBD, I think misses a fundamental question of what will CBDs look like? Because we can see that people are moving out to remote working hubs. Office space is changing. Buildings will change. Lots of, you know, futurists are saying skyscrapers are becoming a thing of the past. And so trying to cling on to get people to buy their sandwich from their CBD is a bit too late. It's, yeah, as you were saying, Catherine, the horse is bolted.
And you know, interesting, Kathy, and Sue, that point about sort of economic activity, the sandwich shop, the, you know, the other retail and so on. You would have noted too those stories about how the suburbia coffee shops and local businesses are booming. So that shifts to accommodate that. So I'm not saying, by the way, that alleviates the pain for those people who have businesses in a CBD. Clearly, in a transitional sense, that's really difficult. But just another little example of this already happening. 6 months ago, one of my daughter's partners, who works for a small economics consulting firm, but they were renting expensive office space in North Sydney. They've downsized massively, taken a small, I think it's a co-working space, so they've got part of it in the middle of Sydney now. And I said, well, will that accommodate everyone? He said, no, absolutely not, because they don't expect everyone to ever be all together in the office again. And I just thought, you know, that's a small, agile business, but it seems to me symptomatic. And the other thing, which is slightly tongue-in-cheek, is that I'm sure I read this, or maybe I was just thinking it. I wonder if a whole lot of those huge skyscrapers in the middle of Sydney turn into luxury apartments, because that seems to be the other part of that commercial property landscape refurbing. And it's happened in a few big skyscrapers in Sydney already. And I just thought, wouldn't that be interesting if that ended up being what happens? And businesses are much more dispersed with a very small HQ, and then all these people working in different areas.
Absolutely. I think we heard the announcements from like Twitter or Tata Consulting Services, large companies, that they're saying we are never going back.
Yeah.
So the new normal was announced like in April or May of 2020. And I think the employers are, you know, the ones who will never go back, the ones who encourage working from home, and the ones who allow working from home. That's probably the spectrum, and everyone is trying to find their way. And actually having the hybrid model may be difficult, really, because if you think about people when they're not in the office, that creates more workload on the people who are in the office if the traffic and the needs that they need to service in that location, are there. So there's definitely impact on the HR, and that's what I like to explore now, and mental health in particular. I personally, when I go home during that 15-minute drive, I have a chance to sort of de-stress and kind of switch. But when I'm working from home, that doesn't happen. It takes me 10 seconds to go to the kitchen. So, and there's many other examples, I'm pretty sure, of how the change in how we work is impacting our well-being. And you mentioned it, Kathy. We did check more on our employees in the early stage of the pandemic and working from home. So what's happening now? What are you concerned about, and what do you think the future will be around looking after people? Kathy.
Yeah, I think it's a really serious issue, and I think we really the whole issue of employee well-being and capacity, as we would call it, the boundaries and boundary management around work and home in terms of hours of work and all these things, as well as the sort of mental health impacts of sitting on a Zoom call for 12 hours a day, and these kind of things. We don't even really know yet, I think, the full probably force of all of that, but we are going to be expecting, I think, for wellbeing, where it might have been organisations had a nice wellbeing strategy on the side that there was a HR policy, written somewhere. It's coming much more front and centre now, and I think that's something new, not new in terms of knowing that we need to care for the wellbeing of our employees, but heightened as an expectation. And then there's this issue of when people aren't, when we don't know that they're away because there's an issue for them in their health and wellbeing, because maybe we might assume they're making a choice to work from home. How do we make sure we are checking in with people and not letting people fall through the cracks in terms of this? I personally do find, in my work, that 12-hour day on back-to-back calls where I actually have to sort of turn my camera off and excuse myself from home just to even use the bathroom. This ridiculous kind of it's brain sapping, isn't it? It's at the end of the day, I've still got real work to do because I've been in meetings all day and my brain just won't go there because it's just exhausted. So I don't have the answers on that, but I'm really interested in how we are going to, and in my work with leaders in organisations, we're very much focusing on, as part of your leadership capability set, we need new mindsets for this new world we're entering into. We certainly need some new skills, but we also need a whole new focus on our own capacity to manage ourselves and our boundaries and our health, and we need to be able to do that for our people as well. And I don't think it's a problem I don't think it's an issue that just sits with HR developing a nice policy for us. We actually need to practice around it. That's different.
Yeah. Whole organization, yeah. Stu?
Yes, and before COVID, this was known as techno stress, which I think is a lovely term. Now we just call it Zoom fatigue. And I think one of the other important issues around this is that techno stress and Zoom fatigue has different impacts on different cohorts of groups. So research is starting to emerge that younger people and Gen Z people are finding working from home more stressful than older employees. It's harder for them to get integrated into teams and to workforces. And then, of course, there's a class element to this as well, where we've been talking generally about knowledge workers who are highly educated, well paid, but there are also all the people that are doing lower level jobs, service centred jobs, customer facing, well, not customer facing, but those customer roles, and they're being put under surveillance. And so that's a different form of techno stress. So their keystrokes are being monitored. Their employer can tell what pages they're on, what they're doing, all those sorts of things. And that's a real concern of the union movement at the moment. And so I think when we're thinking about mental health and well-being, we need to take into account that there will be different impacts on different groups of workers.
Absolutely, and this came now to our homes, right? This is no longer in just the call center. You are the call center in your bedroom, and that employer is present there with you, and so that probably has a high impact. I think, Catherine, you spoke about this as well. How does it impact women in particular?
Well, it probably, again, possibly disproportionately impacts them in the sense that there's probably more of them represented in those jobs. I mean, we know that, and those call centre jobs are incredibly tough. And there's that area that's talked about, emotional labour. So the amount of investment, women answering phones all day, dealing with tetchy people, and we've all been there. Let's be honest, with a call centre, but it's really tough work, and it's not terribly well paid. It's, you know, it is very difficult, and I think, yes, there's certainly, and I know whole call centres did move to the working from home model quite early on, which was, you know, quite a logistical effort. But yes, being isolated, I think, in those circumstances can be really tough. But the other thing I was just thinking back to when we started talking earlier about the need for control, to see people and control them. It's really interesting. I wonder if Kathy's point too about are there increased expectations now that you will have another Zoom call? So what possibly would have been, hey, 5 of us are sitting here. Is everyone, you know, has everyone looked at this? What are we doing about this? Will now become a slightly more formal process where we have to slot in a time. And then we said before coming on today that Zoom is draining. I mean, we've just talked about it as fatigue, and Sue made the very good point. Every time you're on Zoom, it's a performance. You're being looked at. People are, we're all the same. We're looking at, oh, where are they sitting? Oh, is that a book behind them? That's what we do. You've got to look okay, you know, or try. And that kind of stuff is all really draining. And there has been a bit of research done around this. And I've read a couple of reports out of the US saying that's not imaginary. That does make you incredibly tired and drained. So I think that's an issue. And I would also just add in there, clearly women are judged more on how they look. So, you know, I know it will sound like it's peripheral and silly. It's not. You are looked at your age, you know, if you've got makeup on and whatever. It's not the same dynamics as it can be for a bloke. It's not particularly fair. It's the way the world has operated and the social norms that we're brought up with. But that actually adds another layer as well. So, yeah, I think that there's so many dimensions to that. But just finally, on sort of an upside, a friend of mine who's, shall we say, stature challenged, said she found Zoom meetings were a relief. She said there was a bit of democracy because instead of being the tiniest person in the room, who actually found it difficult sometimes to be recognised, to have her voice heard, which is a problem all women at times experience. She said this little square box that she appeared in gave her more chance to be heard. So I think there's some interesting sort of dynamics around that. So it's not all terrible. There's some potential pluses.
Equalizing.
Catherine, can I just add to that, Peter? Sorry, I was working with a group of senior leaders just last week, and one of them talked about the fact that she thought the Zoom meetings had been fantastic because she's an introvert, and the little hand that you get to put up on Teams she was using, the little hand that you get to put up meant that she actually had an opportunity to get into the conversation with all these noisy colleagues that she had, where she often felt she didn't have a voice. So choosing the right forum for, you know, that sort of participation is probably something we have to start to think more and more about.
I think so. And just finally, the chat function with Zoom, when I'm doing presentations, panels and so on, what I have really noticed is how many people put up fantastic questions and comments. And I know if I was doing that live, it wouldn't have that same response. That, I think, is, for me, that is the massive upside. There's lots of downsides not being in the same room with people when you're presenting to them, but goodness, I found that fascinating. And I couldn't say there was a massive gender split there, but really fantastic comments and questions coming up at a higher rate than I would have noticed in the past. So.
Apologies, my connection seems to be less stable now. So that's the techno stress that we are experiencing. I guess all our meetings are starting with, can you hear me? And when we see each other in real life, oh, I didn't know you were so tall. And all of these comments are just showing that we have different experiences. I have a question that's more from industrial relations now. This is a question from Christina, and it's about, can my employer force me to work from the office? What's the legal environment around it? Like, we are now returning to the office. Do I have to accept it? Who wants to pick that one?
Well, I'm not a lawyer, so that's my big caveat before diving into this question. But my understanding would be that if it's safe, that yes, that your employer could require you to work in the office. It would go with when you've signed up for the job and the contract of employment, and you've agreed that, you know, you'll do the work in the employer's space. I think that would hold. If you're starting a job, I think you could negotiate that. But if you've got a current job and it's safe with physical distancing, all that sort of stuff, I think that probably employers can ask people to go back to the workplace. And we're seeing that with, as I was saying, the Victorian government is requiring people to go back. So I think it's going to be difficult for people to refuse to go back to the office if it's safe. Mm-hmm. I could be wrong. I'm not a lawyer, but that's what I think.
What about the right to request flexibility, which I haven't updated myself on this, but for a long time that was brought in. So you definitely had the right to request. Now, it was absolutely the case that employers could knock that back. So, but I would have thought at the moment they'd have to have pretty good grounds to do so. So I'm not saying it's absolutely foolproof, it's not, but my understanding is there is a right to request flexibility. So.
Yeah, the right to request can be refused on operational grounds, which are really broad. And the legislation, the Fair Work Act, does outline what those grounds are, but they are very broad. So I think if someone uses that right to request under the legislation, the employer could say, no, operationally, I need you here to make sure the team is staffed or whatever. But yes, Catherine, it's really interesting that the right to request in the legislation will need to be looked at for people to try and request to not go back into the office. So it'll be a reverse. So I think that is something that will need to be looked at in the future.
Kathy, what's the practice? What are you saying? Are employers competing now on the notion of flexible work, and what does that look like?
I think they are, and I think I'm certainly not a lawyer either, Sue, so I don't want to delve into the legality of it, but certainly as in a competitive employer sense, I think a very core tenet of the employee value proposition now is flexibility, where it's appropriate for that sort of work. I guess you would be maybe putting your head in the sand to be denying people that opportunity. I do think this is a very difficult, tricky issue, and in our own firm in KPMG, we've had many conversations about how are we going to create an environment that enables choice, but also doesn't erode our social capital as an organisation, that enables people to still meet client requirements, all those conditions. So, I think I'm sounding a bit like a broken record, but I just do think we need to be consciously having these conversations as employers and as work, as workplaces, organisations with our people, and also as leaders around how can we make this work for everybody, instead of just defaulting to a particular norm because it's historically worked for us. This is the world we're in, I think, is the conscious creation of the workplaces that we need, that are fit for purpose to get the outcomes we want, but also recognise that we've got this huge opportunity to create joy in work out of this, rather than, sort of defaulting to something that where there was that very much a traditional power. We've been working with a lot of businesses in regional Australia as part of a government program, and a lot of it's about creating more diversity in the workforces in some traditionally, probably not very diverse workplaces. And, COVID had been a huge game changer in that, in some of the conversations we were having with, particularly with men, I guess, around flexible work, that's for girls, this job can't be done flexibly. All these views that aren't contemporary and don't necessarily serve the business well, let alone the employment of people from outside of what might have been traditional paradigms. So COVID really gave us a lockstep change in the conversations where we said, well, actually flexible work can work for us here. Oh, now we can start to have some different discussions about who we employ, how we employ them, what the rules around that employment are. And that's been liberating for those businesses and for some of those local economies as well, as businesses start to think differently about who they can employ. So I think we've just got to keep having the conversation and change it up.
Totally agree. And you know what excites me as someone involved in innovation? A lot of times we work with people who are sort of trying to disrupt, and they are looking at uncertainty and how they can navigate through it. And I think, as you said, COVID has made this a popular theme. This has now, everyone understands what disruption is, what adaptation and flexibility is. We can have conversations like this one across the board, across our value chains and industry relationships and so on. And I think that some of the questions here are about the control and sort of the tables and being sort of rigid about how we set up systems that will work. And what you just said just reminds me so much of a startup entrepreneur, and that is like, we will not have the correct answer for everything. We will have to adapt and see what works and create the mix with the people. They will have to be able to participate in it. And there's different situations for that benefit different modes of work. And everyone is tasked now to find how that is and input that conversation. So I have a question about this flexibility and how do you create that culture in the workplace that supports this flexibility and gives a permission that we may not know tomorrow exactly what system to launch, and we will experiment ourselves into the future? That's an innovator's question. So who wants to pick that up first, Sue?
Yes, I think, as Kathy was saying, it does go to organisational culture and building it in. And I think it could be easy for organisations, particularly public sector organisations, to try and revert back to business as usual. And the research says that trying to innovate during times of crisis doesn't work because people want to revert back to what they know and what's normal. And so I think could be a sense that we've done COVID, let's go back to what we know, what's familiar with people working in the office. But we know that, life is moving on and that a hybrid workforce is pretty much inevitable. And in terms of organisational culture, I've seen things in workplaces where the conversation is happening all the time around gender equality and flexible working arrangements. From small things like having photos of people and their pets on the wall as you walk into the office. And we've seen that during the pandemic when, we all know each other's pets now. And so I think that trying to embed those sorts of small things is a really good start to ensuring that we keep that flexibility and keep those conversations going.
Catherine, flexibility.
Yeah, look, as I say, I've been a strong advocate for flexibility for, a few decades now. And I think this is an opportunity to actually embed some of this. And I think it has to be, as I said before, the research coming out is really clearly indicating that most people are really after a hybrid model. On a practical level, one of the things I've gone back to, and I was thinking about this recently, some years ago, I think it was IBM, introduced what they called core hours of a day in their office. So between, I think, 10 a.m. and 3 p.m, something like that, was the only time of the day you could schedule a meeting. And that was there was a clear intent behind that. So anything that happened before 10 a.m, and after 3 p.m. could compromise people who had other commitments, caring, whether it was men or women. And it just made it very clear. And I was thinking, why not actually translate that into, as we look further ahead and we want to be a bit more organised, instead of just saying, oh, it's hybrid, you know, you might be at home that day. That I can understand could be a bit of a logistical nightmare. Why don't we have core days? And my understanding is that some organisations are starting to look at this. So we'll have 2 or 3 days where ideally you would be in the office, unless you have another arrangement. But that's the days that we're in. And I've actually interviewed people over the years. I did a study, wrote up some interviews with the male champions of change some years ago when they were still all men. And there was someone at Commonwealth Bank who was running their online securities trading operation. And he said, Friday is the day that you don't have to be in the office, that we do all our other kind of teamwork and so on during the other. And then Friday, you might be in or you might not. And it was just being very organised about that. And I mentioned earlier on why that matters so much to people who are taking the main responsibility for caring. And that tends to be women, because they need to organise childcare or they need to have somebody who's looking after whatever. So having some predictability around that. So I think when we talk about a hybrid model, maybe we should be a little bit more sort of, you know, practical about it and actually think about the ways that that could actually operate. I also know, and this is probably slightly out of date, but a few months ago, someone was telling me they had a rule in their office. So if there were a few people in the office and they wanted to have a meeting, but some people were working from home, everyone went on to Zoom. So it wasn't a gang of us in the conference room all having a bit of a chit chat. We all do it on Zoom. So you make the playing field as much as you can an even one. So I think that's interesting to think about as one of those other practical and fairly pragmatic sort of steps to making a hybrid model work.
Absolutely. I think we haven't yet found a good way how to have the hybrid meetings when you're sort of passing the computer on the lap so that people can see, or have other arrangements that are not technically as good as having those conversations in the room. And I think, Catherine, thank you, because you answered a question here from Alison, I think, who was asking about these limits on flexibility. What if there were some limits? So there's also a question from Nick, and I'll ask you, Kathy. And this is about how do you convert this flexibility into a policy? So, you know, like what can we do to kind of move forward to know what we are all doing in terms of flexibility?
Yes, well, I think Catherine started to touch on that there about some agreements around, you know, days in the office and so on. And we're certainly doing that in KPMG in our teams. There are teams who are saying, well, Wednesdays and Thursdays are the days that we're all going to try and be in the office, working where you can, or certain hours, that sort of thing. We have, I can share maybe our experience of trying to be adaptive and have a policy, which I think is you know, the critical thing here, because we are in a world of complexity and things are going to keep emerging and changing and shifting. So we have to be able to be adaptive in our policy agendas, I think. But you know, KPMG early on, we started to think about, as we return, you know, what does this mean? And so we have a 3-hub model, we call it, where we ask people to think about their home-based hub, their KPMG office-based hub, and their client site hub. And we are asking people to make the explicit, you know, decisions about where am I best placed to achieve results today? Is it in the home hub, at the client site hub, or in the office hub? And based on, you know, what work has to be done and the outcomes you're trying to deliver. Now, that's one set of kind of a framing, I guess, of putting choice back to individuals, but also remembering it's not just about, you know, I'd rather sit in my pajamas today and so I won't go to that client meeting. There's some responsibility to focus on the outcomes. But, I think the policies do need to flex, and I think we are needing, to really think a little bit about how we get that balance right between structure and order, and evolution of things as we learn more about what works and what doesn't for our own organisation. And it also goes to the point that I was making earlier about we seem to be developing, place-based. We've got property people working on their property issues, and we've got tech people thinking about the new technologies, and we've got the HR people thinking about the people issues. And I think we're in a world where we need to start to bring those together into integrated strategies that are related to our, as I keep saying, our aspiration as a workplace, and get much more, collaboration around those decisions about how the workplace and the tech and the people all enable, the work to be done.
A fascinating debate, I guess, about the future uncertainty and how we respond, how we self-organize to deliver to it and have people integral part of it. I think for another webinar, I'm sure. So here's a personal question, and I announced that this will be the last question, and I'll ask you all. And that's a question from George, and it's about you. How do you find working from home? Do you do it? What's your best tips and tricks and advice how to make it work? So whoever wants to start this is about you personally. How do you find it?
Yeah, I'll jump in. Before I do, I just wanted to pick up on really quickly on a point that Catherine was making around core hours. The public service has had core hours for a million years. And yes, they're a good thing, but my take is, why do we need core hours? I think for increased flexibility, throw out core hours. And if people want to start work at 4 PM and work till midnight, I think that should be allowed. And when I talk to organisations, I encourage them to experiment with job design and trying to make it jobs that fit the people, not people fit the jobs, and to be really flexible and think about how jobs can be done and to have that level of flexibility. So just a point there. In terms,
just to make it clear, the core hours were for meetings, so you can work whatever hours you like. Yeah. But meetings with more than, a couple of people were just during core hours. So it was not suggesting you couldn't work after 4 PM or anything like that. Yeah.
Yes, as an academic, I work from home a lot. It suits me. I get to spend time with my dogs, which is lovely. The thing that I find most important is to exercise at the end of each day, and that's my buffer between working, stopping work, exercise, and then having dinner, and then going back to work.
The balance is super important. So, and finding ways how to do it. Catherine, how about you?
So I left a formal workplace about 8 or 9 years ago and went from a newsroom, which you can probably imagine was a fairly lively place. And it took me a while to understand what was the thing I was missing. And I have to say there wasn't much. Mm-hmm. I shouldn't put that. I love my career there, but I was still writing. So I was still doing the job, but I was doing it from home. But the thing I missed the most was the discussion with my colleagues and peers. Journalists are an interesting bunch. We didn't agree, but that was one of those environments where it was a good thing to not agree. There was such lively debates about what was happening that day, about issues and so on. I got so much nourishment from that. And I realized that I would need to, in some way, replace that. So I have a wonderful network of friends, some of whom are still in a kind of formal workplace journalism, many of them freelance. And I absolutely make sure I'm quite rigorous about catching up. At least once a week, I'll have lunch, coffee, chat, sometimes more than that. So that was, I think, working out the thing that I missed and working out a way that I could still kind of access that, I suppose.
Fantastic, thank you. And isn't it interesting how we communicate a lot on Zoom and we miss conversations? And what we mean is these micro conversations, the water cooler, the serendipitous. And I think that's what makes us tick and think, and I think it's so important. So well said, Catherine. And Kathy, over to you. How is working from home working for you, and how do you find the balance between life and work?
It's a tricky challenge. I had a really profound change when the COVID lockdown started, because for the last 20 years of my career, I've spent almost 3 days a week in another city on a plane, traveling all over the place. And so my life has been in one, a series of suitcases in various stages of unpacking or repacking for a very, very long time. And overnight, I just stopped traveling. And I stopped traveling for a year. I just got on my first plane last week to start traveling again, which was actually quite worrying and disturbing. But it's fine because I'm still here. So I have spent a lot of time on Zoom, and I live between Canberra and the South Coast. So I have been able to, sort of go and set myself up remotely at the South Coast and still feel like I'm connecting with my team and connecting with my clients. And although despite that has felt a little bit like worlds colliding, so I've kind of found myself coming back to work in Canberra more, even if I'm at home working in Canberra. I have been taking walking meetings. So I have at least one meeting a day where I'm walking and talking on the phone, Catherine, you'll be pleased to know, not on Zoom. People don't seem to mind the huffing and puffing, but it doesn't work when it's windy. So that's a bit tricky. So look, I've really enjoyed it. And what I have found though is we've opened a new office in Canberra just last week for KPMG, and it's we were in a very small, very different kind of workspace. And so I'm noticing a lot of people coming into the office because we've got this beautiful space with these beautiful views and new desks. It's all very new and social, and lots of collaboration spaces. And so I think I'll probably spend more time back in the office as the next few months unfold. And the one other thing that I've done to keep a balance, I guess, is I've had that flexibility to go once a week. I have 2 grandsons, and once a week I go and pick them up from preschool and have them for the afternoon, and then I go back to work afterwards. And that's just been an absolute delight to have the privilege to do that, which I never would have had before. So that's me.
Thank you. Thank you for your tips and tricks here. I must admit that I'm not great at it. And especially coming from Europe, I have a lot of requests for meetings in the evening hours and morning hours and family, and the fatigue from the screen is a real thing. And I really appreciate that I can come to the office and have those micro conversations. I'm an extrovert, so I really source a lot from having those conversations. So this was a fascinating panel. Our time is up, and it was great to conclude more on a personal note, because this is a change that's massive, that's affecting all of us, affecting our families, not only our workplace. It's affecting the way we commute, the way our cities are used, the resource and infrastructure requirements for that, and so we will be adjusting as a society, not only in Australia but globally, to this massive disruption for a very long time. And I predict that this adjustment will never end. It will be something that will be always with us. And I am excited about the flexibility, the awareness of flexibility and what it can bring, but also the tensions with the need for structure and safety and so on. Places where there's like errors are not allowed. And we have lots of those places, including and starting with healthcare or airplanes, etc., etc. So it's an interesting space, very ripe for innovation, and innovation not only that's technological, but innovation how we think and how we exist in these places. Thank you very much to all of our fantastic panelists, Dr. Sue Williamson, Catherine Fox, and Kathy Hilliard. You have been amazing, and thank you. And on behalf of UNSW Canberra and University of New South Wales more broadly, and Canberra Innovation Network, thank you for sharing your views, honest, open opinions on what's the future going to look like. And thank you to our viewers for posting your questions. This session has been recorded and will be shared via email with everyone who registered. We look forward to seeing you at future UNSW events, and best of luck in adjusting to this new normal. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.